great question. It presumes he's an American citizen. Well, my gut wants to answer that question this way. Of course he would vote, because that's what good Americans do.
I think Jesus would take sides in terms of values. The issue of racism, for instance. White privilege has kept black people down for decades and decades and decades, and Jesus would say, you can't treat people like that. You've got to recognize what's going on in your lives.
I think that today, Jesus's original message has gotten lost, and it's gotten lost in skewed intentions where people try to use Christianity and the Bible as a way to oppress others or to other people. And I just believe that if Jesus was alive today, I think he would be appalled to see how Christians, so-called Christians, behave and treat other people, how we treat children, how we treat people of color in this country, how we treat people who do not identify as heterosexual, white, rich male. So I think Jesus would probably be a little appalled, and Jesus would probably be one of the oppressed in America, for sure.
God, through Christ, was interested in the poor. He focused on folks who did not have enough and suggested that we ought to live in a simple way. That I don't disagree that wealth can be a good, useful thing, in fact, and we should not feel guilty if somehow we've inherited money or we've made our own money. But you're right, the question is, how are we using that? What are we doing with that? I think Jesus would, as I say, look at the systems we have in place. He would look, for instance, at the incredible difference between the so-called top 1% and the bottom, and say, people, there's something wrong here. This is a broken system. So let's find public policies that address that. He would look at the ways in which our schools are failing our children and say, these are children that we ought to be loving and giving an opportunity to, and let's find ways, given the public school system that we have here, of doing better, of figuring that out.
I see in the two political parties that exist either an emphasis on me or an emphasis on we. The world that I've come to embrace and that I live in now focuses way more on the village mentality of, if you're not okay, we're not okay. If you're in pain, we're in pain. If you're at loss, we're at loss. And for me, I see that in a biblical sense. If you look at Acts in the early church, it says they sold everything they had and gave to anybody in their community that was in need. They came together and devoted themselves to these things. Nobody wanted for anything. And yet I can't figure out how that principle hasn't continued on.
I think Jesus very definitely would challenge people. He did in his own day. Those parables are tremendously challenging. Able to listen to him speaking to our community today, he would give us a lot to think about. You think about his message and you put it in contrast with how you're living your life, and you might not feel so enthusiastic about it all. I think Jesus would have that kind of effect.
He would say, are you kidding me? You've got all this wealth in the world, and you've got people in this country who can't get decent health care coverage? There's something wrong with that. We Americans focus on the individual, what's right for me, and we lose this idea of the common good. The question finally is, are you sacrificing the good you can do to needy individuals and to ministry to people in need for your own self-aggrandizement?
It's absolutely obvious that Jesus would be espousing those policies that would most help our most vulnerable. He would be most against the billionaires who now control our government. He would kick them out of his temple. He did kick the billionaires of ancient Jerusalem out of the temple. And he would be trying his best to provide charity for the people who most need it.
I think Jesus would side with the people that are merciful. And I see a lot of stances, platforms, campaigns on the left politically that really do value people and that really do not just care about whether or not they're born, but care about them when they're here, that care about their well-being, that give people second and third and fourth chances. Jesus, to his credit, would find a way to try and talk to both sides, but I think Jesus would celebrate a lot of the things that happen on the political left, because I think a lot of those issues and a lot of those campaigns, a lot of those efforts are going to reach the people that Jesus spent a lot of time with. And I think Jesus wanted that to happen and would fight and advocate for that to happen.
Political style and attitude, and when I bring together Barack Obama and Donald Trump, I see a significant amount of humility on one hand, and I see a great deal of hubris on the other. And that sense of being willing to learn, Jesus had this line over and over again, "He who has ears, let him hear." And I get that sense, that political persuasion sense from Barack Obama, not from Donald Trump. So when we think about where would Jesus align, to whose camp would he kind of be more comfortable in, I can definitely see it more comfortable in a more a humility-based political approach rather than a kind of more arrogant, boastful. Even the phrase, "Make America great again," is fascinating. The emphasis on greatness and the emphasis on strength and power when Jesus told stories about how it was the poor widow's prayer and it was the least of these who would be first. Jesus went to pains to say that his kingdom wasn't of this world, and so I think what would happen is he would try to avoid any political alignment, and that everyone else, Fox News and CNN, would try to push him into one of those. But I don't think there's any way in the world I could foresee, Jesus pulling a lever for the Republican Party, and the reasons for that. One would be an unwillingness to admit wrong. And what I find interesting about that is, the Lord's Prayer, the most famous prayer Jesus ever says, "Forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us." And the Republican Party and Donald Trump seem awfully insistent on never apologizing, and when it comes to issues of race, whether it's slavery, segregation, lynching, not only do they not want to apologize, they want to be in cahoots. They want to kind of bring in people who celebrate those traditions. So I can't see how Jesus, his morals, his teachings would fit. I could see Jesus saying to Donald Trump, "Leave everything and follow me." I could see him basically saying, "Hey, if you want," kind of like the young prince, the biblical story where Jesus says to the prince, "Hey, there's one thing you haven't done. Leave all of your wealth, leave all of your status, and come and follow me." And the prince leaves unhappy because he doesn't want to do that. But yeah, I can't see any way in the world that Jesus would buddy up with the Republican Party.
There are two tracks we can go down to show how Jesus would never align himself with the Republican Party. And I'm talking about the Republican Party after the passage of the Civil Rights Bills of the 1960s, because moderate Republicans were very instrumental in the passing of those bills. But as white backlash mounted after the passage of the Civil Rights Bills, the Republican Party was more than happy to switch from the party of Lincoln to the party of the Southern Lost Cause. This first track is racism. I don't think Jesus is going to make the same mistake many good Americans make by joining a voting bloc that contains the KKK, white nationalists, and white supremacists. If you are a Republican today, how do you look in the mirror and say, "I vote with some of the worst elements of human nature and the worst parts of American history"? I don't think there's much debate on this issue. Jesus is not going to vote with the tiki torch wing of the Republican Party. The other track is policy. This track is barely debatable, but issues certainly can be debated. But when you bring in the teachings of Jesus, it becomes very obvious, at least to me, that the main tenets of the Republican Party go against the teachings of Jesus. He was mainly concerned about the welfare of the sick and the poor. The tenets of small government, low taxes, free market capitalism, restrictions on immigration, increased military spending, deregulation and restrictions on labor unions, all these tenets go against helping the sick and the poor. Do low taxes help the poor? Does free market capitalism help the sick? Does restricted immigration help God's children? Does increased military spending help the homeless? Does deregulation and restrictions on labor unions help the poor trying to get a living wage so they can pull themselves up by their bootstraps? I'm not sure how you can follow Jesus and vote Republican. You're going to have to pick a side. Are you going to follow the teachings of Christ? Or are you going to vote Republican and keep your taxes low and not help the people that Jesus wants us to help? Here's the thing. If you're well off, you don't need big government. You don't need universal health care. You don't need a great public educational system. You don't need a social safety net. Your money and your wealth is your personal social safety net. It's the poor and the sick that need a bigger government that provides critical public assistance. It's the poor and the sick that need increased taxes for universal health care. It's the poor and the working class that need strong unions. The titans of industry and corporate America don't need strong unions. They need a Republican Party that is trying its best to undo the strength of unions that historically provided Americans with well-paying jobs. Oh, but wait, you say, what about voting on social issues like abortion and gay marriage? Well, if you want to go down that track, you might as well change the name of the Republican Party to the Party of Lost Causes. There's obviously nothing wrong with personally being against having an abortion. Nobody is pro-abortion. But according to a 2019 Pew Research Center poll on abortion finds that 70% of Americans believe Roe v. Wade should not be completely overturned. So 7 out of 10 Americans do not want to criminalize access to abortion. That is a lost cause, especially if you consider the danger to women if abortion was criminalized. Imagine if the pro-life voting bloc put as much energy into getting health care and food security for the children instead of trying to criminalize women's access to abortion. Also in a 2019 Pew poll, 61% of Americans support same-sex marriage. That number continues to climb. Remember, Jesus was inclusive. We are all God's children, whether we are straight, gay, or trans. Whether it's immigration, marriage equality, or civil rights, Jesus taught us to advocate for the downtrodden, the powerless, and the marginalized. Jesus was in essence a community organizer, trying to help people, teaching us to love our neighbors both near and far. So when Barack Obama ran for the presidency in 2008, he was lambasted by conservatives and media on the right for being a community organizer. Why would Jesus vote with a party that thinks being a community organizer is less than? I think Jesus could find a home in the Democratic Party because the Democrats are advocating for the same people that Jesus advocated for. His only question would be, why aren't you doing more to help the children of God?
Republican Party has always sort of used this kind of race baiting strategy, right? Beginning with the Southern strategy to, once again, at the public feeling level, those emotional economies that I was talking about, create and cultivate what has always been an undercurrent, which is the potential, the political value of white resentment. So that anytime there is this kind of push towards expanding the social wage, so that it's fair to women, it's fair to poor people, it's fair to people of color, whether through affirmative action or through fair housing policy or through better educationally funded schools or through desegregation, right? That anytime there's a push for that, the Republican Party has sort of used this race baiting, dog whistle politics to revamp the sense that, hey, white Americans, you're about to lose something here. You're about to be encroached upon in terms of your advantages and social positioning by all these factions, right? And that has almost always worked to essentially bring a much more conservative agenda in place.
The Republicans catered to the perceived needs of people in the rural South in terms of religious fundamentalism, anti-gay, anti-abortion, gun rights, in terms of racial discrimination, American injustice, long prison sentences for blacks. These were tools used by the Republican Party to capture the South. And then the next extension was to realize that these same policies would be very popular in states in the North that had large rural populations that were suffering greatly during the mechanization of labor, no more farm laborers, a decrease in factory work because of the robotics, and the taking of jobs from rural America, industrial factories, and planting them in Mexico and then in Asia. That these places were suffering, and that the same policies that had been effective in capturing the South of the United States would be effective in capturing rural areas in the rest of America. So the Republican Party became the party of the past, the party of older people, the party of the most bitter, the most worried about change, the most worried about new social configurations, the increasing power of women, the increasing power of black civil rights, the increasing power of gay civil rights. The Republicans represented themselves as the protectors of the past for people who were very frightened of the present and very uncertain about the future.
You know, I love Jesus more than I love the church. And people are sometimes surprised to hear me say that as a pastor. But there are times I think Jesus calls me to hold the church accountable when it's been less than loving. And I'm clear that when we worship in here on Saturday night and Sunday morning, we don't worship the church. We come to worship God. And we come to worship the God revealed to us in Jesus. And that God revealed in Christ sometimes calls us to be in conflict with the church and with the law of the church. And I'm comfortable in that place, finally, after many years of ministry. And I'm thankful for Jesus, who calls me to be bold and brave, even when it's contrary to what the world is teaching.